Have you ever felt that someone secretly wanted to see you fail, even though they always smiled at you? They congratulate you, support you, and tell you they're happy for your success. But somehow, something changes. Their words become colder. Their excitement fades. Their presence slowly disappears. At first, it feels confusing. Then you begin to wonder if you've done something wrong. According to Jung, the answer may have nothing to do with your actions and everything to do with what your growth awakens inside other people. Jung believed that some of the strongest resentment is never expressed openly. It hides behind compliments, fake concern, and polite conversations. The people who secretly resent you rarely admit it, not even to themselves. Instead, they project their own fears, regrets, and insecurities onto the person who reminds them of everything they could have become. And without realizing it, you become the target of emotions that were never truly about you. What you're about to discover isn't simply a theory about jealousy. It's a psychological pattern that has shaped human relationships for generations. Once you recognize these hidden mechanisms, you'll begin to notice behaviors that once seemed ordinary, but now reveal a completely different meaning. By the end of this video, you may never look at certain people the same way again. Most people believe resentment begins after an argument, a betrayal, or an obvious act of disrespect. Jung saw something much more subtle. He believed that people often become uncomfortable not because of what you say or do, but because of what your life silently reflects back to them. Sometimes your existence becomes a mirror they never wanted to face, revealing truths they have spent years trying to avoid. Imagine two friends who start from the exact same place. They share the same dreams, the same struggles, and even the same excuses. But over time, one of them begins to change. They become more disciplined, more confident, and more focused. They stop waiting for the perfect moment and start taking action. At first, nothing seems different between them. Then, without warning, the relationship slowly begins to shift. The friend who stayed behind doesn't always feel inspired by your progress. Instead, your growth quietly reminds them of every opportunity they ignored, every promise they broke to themselves, and every fear they allowed to control their decisions. Your success becomes evidence that change was always possible. That realization is often far more painful than people are willing to admit. Jung described this as one of the hidden movements of the human psyche. Rather than confronting uncomfortable emotions directly, the mind searches for someone else to carry the weight. Instead of saying, "I regret my choices," it becomes much easier to believe, "You've changed," or "You think you're better than everyone else." The blame moves away from them and quietly lands on you. This is why criticism sometimes appears the moment your life begins improving. It rarely starts with direct attacks. It begins with small comments disguised as jokes, unexpected silence after your achievements, or subtle attempts to make you question your own decisions. On the surface, these reactions seem harmless. Beneath them, however, something much deeper is taking place. The truth is that your transformation forces other people to compare their present reality with the life they imagined for themselves. Most comparisons happen unconsciously. They don't wake up deciding to resent you. Instead, each new step you take becomes another reminder of the steps they never had the courage to take. Over time, that silent comparison slowly turns into emotional resistance. Ironically, the more humble you remain, the more confusing this behavior becomes. You never asked to compete. You never tried to make anyone feel inferior. You simply refused to remain the same person forever. Yet, for someone trapped by fear or regret, Your quiet evolution feels like an accusation, even when you never intended to judge them. This is where Jung's psychology becomes both fascinating and unsettling. The problem is rarely your success itself. The real problem is what your success awakens inside someone who has been hiding from their own potential. And once that hidden conflict begins, the human mind will do almost anything to avoid looking inward. Instead, it begins searching for reasons why you must somehow be the one at fault. The question is, if your growth can trigger emotions that people don't even understand themselves, what happens when those buried feelings become impossible to ignore? That is where Jung's idea of the shadow begins to reveal its true power. If people rarely understand why they resent you, then where does that feeling actually come from? Carl Jung believed the answer lies within what he called the shadow. It is the hidden part of the personality where every fear, insecurity, and painful truth is buried. Most people spend their lives pretending this side of themselves doesn't exist, but the shadow never disappears. It simply waits for something to bring it into the light. That trigger is often another person, someone who possesses the confidence, discipline, or freedom they secretly wish they had. Instead of asking themselves why that person makes them uncomfortable, the mind takes a much easier path. It creates a story. They're arrogant. They've changed. Success has gone to their head. These explanations feel convincing because they protect the ego from facing a far more painful reality. Jung called this process projection. Rather than confronting what lives inside us, we unconsciously place those unwanted feelings onto someone else. The remarkable part is that the person being judged usually has no idea this is happening. They simply notice that the relationship feels different. Conversations become colder. Support slowly disappears. A quiet distance begins to grow without any clear reason. This is why some of the strongest resentment appears without a single argument. Nothing dramatic has happened. The only thing that changed is you. And sometimes that's enough to awaken emotions another person has spent years trying to suppress. But if the shadow explains why people begin to resent you, there's another question Carl Jung believed was even more important. Why do some people hide those feelings instead of expressing them openly? If resentment is so powerful, why don't people simply admit they feel it? According to Carl Jung, the ego is designed to protect the image we have of ourselves. Most people want to believe they are kind, supportive, and fair. Admitting that someone else's success makes them feel small would shatter that image. So instead of expressing resentment honestly, the mind disguises it in ways that appear completely reasonable. That's why hidden resentment rarely sounds like hatred. It often arrives as advice you never asked for, concern that feels strangely discouraging, or constant reminders of everything that could go wrong. On the surface, these words seem caring, but beneath them is an unconscious attempt to make you question your decisions. If you stop growing, they no longer have to confront the uncomfortable emotions your progress awakened inside them. Sometimes the signs are even quieter. They celebrate your achievements with less enthusiasm than before. They stop asking about your goals. They disappear when things are going well, but suddenly reappear when you experience failure. It isn't always intentional. In many cases, they don't realize that your struggles make them feel more comfortable, because your success quietly challenged the story they told themselves about their own lives. Jung believed that the greatest illusions are often the ones we create to protect ourselves. Hidden resentment is one of those illusions. It allows people to avoid looking inward by keeping their attention fixed on someone else. And once you begin to recognize this pattern, another question naturally appears. How can you tell the difference between genuine concern and someone who secretly wants you to stay exactly where you are. The most surprising part is that people rarely begin to resent you when you're struggling. They often resent you when you stop needing their approval. The moment you become more confident, more independent, or more comfortable with yourself, the balance of the relationship changes. Without realizing it, you've stepped outside the role they expected you to play. And for some people, losing that familiar version of you feels like losing control. That's why they don't always fight your success directly. Sometimes they simply stop walking beside you. Carl Jung believed that personal growth always comes with a cost. As you become more aware of yourself, some relationships naturally begin to fade. This doesn't always mean the other person is evil or jealous. Sometimes they simply feel safer around the version of you that never challenged them. Growth changes your conversations, your priorities, and even your energy. And not everyone is willing to evolve at the same pace. Accepting that reality is often one of the hardest parts of becoming who you were meant to be. Carl Jung never encouraged people to see enemies everywhere, or assume that every act of criticism was driven by jealousy. His message was far more profound. The greatest danger is not that others project their shadow onto you, but that you spend your life chasing their approval. The moment your self-worth depends on how others see you, you hand them control over your peace, your confidence, and ultimately, your future. True freedom begins when you understand that not everyone is meant to celebrate your growth. Some people will quietly walk away, others will misunderstand your intentions, and a few may even resent the person you are becoming. None of those reactions define your value. They simply reveal where each person is in their own psychological journey. Your responsibility is not to carry their emotional burdens, but to continue becoming the person you were created to be. Perhaps the most powerful lesson Jung left us is that real transformation is never about changing other people. It is about having the courage to face yourself, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Once you stop seeking permission to grow, hidden resentment loses its influence over your life. And from that moment forward, you are no longer living to fit into someone else's expectations. You are finally living as your authentic self,